So David Sanger is an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School and a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He is a national security correspondent at the New York Times. During his career at the Times, he has been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. His newest book, which really sets the tone for the keynote, is The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, which was published in 2018 and examines the emergence of cyber conflict as the primary way large and small states are competing and undercutting each other, changing the nature of global power. Stay tuned, because that book is also going to be coming to HBO as a documentary later this year. Also, from a logistics perspective, this keynote will have a question and answer component. So for those of you who are joining us live on GoToMeeting, please post your questions in the Q&A aspect of GoToMeeting, and we will try to get to them at the Q&A portion of David's talk.
You guys able to hear me?
David, we are able to hear you. However, we cannot see you. I just sent you a webcam request.
Okay, hold on a sec. Let me see if I can go to how to go see you. Share my webcam. Okay, now you ought to be able to see me.
We are good to go. I have done the introduction. I talked about the perfect weapon, and the floor is yours.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much, Bryson. Sorry for the technical difficulties in getting in to go see all of you, but it's wonderful to be with you today and to have the chance to sort of talk a little bit about the relationship between the kind of threats that you are looking at and the kind that I've spent my time on. As a journalist, as Bryson has told you, I've spent the past decade or so focused on evolving nation-state threats to the United States. And that's made clear to me that we're in a pretty new world, one of constant low-level conflict, in which cyber is used to gain political advantage, to send messages between regimes, frequently unfriendly ones, to accelerate conflict or the threat of conflict without spilling into military action. And what's really fascinating about the cyber conflicts of the past decade or so is that while we've had many of them, and many of them are ongoing right now, none of them have actually resulted in someone sending a missile, with one exception we can discuss later on involving Israel, or a tank or a land force in to go accelerate the action. So you've now all seen the result of that. The Russians, and to a lesser degree the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, have all gone deep into some of our most vital infrastructure and control systems. It was China that got into America's gas pipeline network, nearly a decade ago. And years later, we're still trying to figure out if the goal was to see whether they had the possibility of interrupting that network and cutting off our gas supplies in midwinter, or whether they were still simply seeking to steal the technology of automated gas pipeline control, maybe both. The Iranians were deep into America's financial networks in 2011, 2012, 2013, and you saw the interruptions to ordinary banking. They went into the industrial control system of a dam in Westchester County. Now, the mullahs might have checked with me because as a young boy who grew up a few miles from that dam, I used to play on it with my junior high school friends, and we could have told the mullahs that it hasn't had any water in it in about a half a century. But of course, they never asked. Their biggest success, as you'll see laid out in the HBO documentary of The Perfect Weapon that Bryson referred to, which will be broadcast a month from today on October 16th, was in turning off the Sands Casino. I can't think of anything nastier you could do to a country than go attack its casinos. I mean, they really understand where Americans live and what they do. But the success of that, one that Sands went to great lengths to try to hide, and you'll see operators from Sands talking, their faces and voices disguised so that the casino owners don't go after them after all their non-disclosure agreements, but you'll get a sense of the chaos that they went and created. And of course, the Russians have been deeply inside our power grids in ways the Department of Homeland Security has described in significant detail. And that has prompted the warnings for many years now that Russia could, at the flick of a switch, turn off the power from Boston to Washington or Seattle to Los Angeles. Though I imagine if you're living on the West Coast this week, that may seem like the least of the threats you need to worry about. So a few things are worth asking. The first is, why hasn't this happened yet? Why haven't we seen a really big attack on the most critical infrastructure that we're out there to go protect? Well, one answer to that question, which I suggested in my earlier comments here, is that the risk of escalation is simply too great. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians all know what would happen if you caused a nationwide power blackout. The chance that it would escalate into military action are probably pretty high. The second is that we have sent various signals to go try to deter them. Many of you may remember reading in early 2019 a story that my colleague Nicole Perlroth and I did about how the US Cyber Command and NSA had put code into the Russian grid that they meant the Russians to see. Now, it was and remains today a highly classified operation. It goes back pretty far. The early origins of it are actually in the Obama years. But the concept was basically to very publicly signal to the Russians with code they were intended to see that if they messed in our power grid, we could do the same in Moscow or St. Petersburg and so forth. And that was part of why we ran the story, because even though the operation was classified, they had obviously intended for the Russians to see the code. And we thought it was important for Americans to understand how it is that the United States is attempting to deter these things. Now, it's also worth asking how nations make this calculation and how they decide whether or not they are going to try to continue to affect American perceptions of their power. And that's a really hard question. And never has it been more vital than in the next, say, 45 days, as we try to take some of the lessons from the successful deterrence in the power grid arena and turn it into some lessons for the less successful deterrence in the election space. And that's a really hard issue to go try to determine, because right now the calculus among the Russians, maybe to a lesser degree the Chinese and the Iranians and the North Koreans, is that there isn't as big a penalty for going after the electoral infrastructure. Why do I say that? Well, just last week, we saw Microsoft report that the GRU, the same Russian intelligence operative who went into the Democratic National Committee and John Podesta's emails in 2016, were back and operating, going after both parties in 2020. And while the NSA has done some things to push them back in the 2018 election and tells us that they're doing similar kinds of operations in 2020, the fact that we're seeing the GRU still operating in this space tells you that the deterrence hasn't been complete, although it's very possible that the Russians may determine that this time the price would simply be too high. I think part of the answer here is that unless our adversaries are convinced that we're willing to take as severe an action to protect our election infrastructure as we would be to take the power grid, they will probably consider this to be an open field available for them to mess around. And that alone is pretty interesting, because what it means is that every state is doing a calculus about whether a certain form of infrastructure is so vital to American interests that we would seriously be willing to escalate in a big way if we were attacked. And I'm not sure in the election space that they are persuaded of that, in part because President Trump has played down the whole idea that the Russians are interfering at all, because they've been raising the more likely possibility in the minds of the White House that it's China and Iran that we have to worry about. But the big question is, in the signaling of our national resolve, have we made it clear that any country that plays a divisive role in our election infrastructure or in the disinformation space might pay a significant price for it? And so far, I'm not sure that we've sent that message as effectively as we have perhaps in the utility industry arena, for example. We play a lot of this out in the HBO documentary. You'll learn a lot about how the North Koreans got into Sony and the debate inside the Obama administration at the time about whether that was an act of war, an act of vandalism, or just an act of kind of corporate graffiti. You'll learn a lot about the SANS attack. You'll learn a lot about the Chinese going in after the Office of Personnel Management, where they cleared out about 22 million security files. These were all examples of foreign states that went in testing the American system, determining what it is that we would likely push back on, or that alternatively we wouldn't be willing to push back on at all. Well, Bryson, I think I'll leave it at that and look forward to the conversation with all of you. I'm happy to take you further into any of these areas, including that fascinating American planting of code inside the Russian utility systems. Thanks again for having me here today.
Yeah, no, thank you. So actually, the first question comes related to the Russians. You mentioned them getting deep inside the power grid. Do you think that the new critical infrastructure protection standards coming in October and the bulk power system executive order could make a difference, or is that targeted more toward hurting China?
That's a really good question. I think your next speaker is from DOE and wrote a good deal of that bulk power executive order. So I think it would be a really good question to ask him, and I'll be interested in the answer. As far as we can tell about the bulk power order, the origins of it were that the United States had ordered up, or an electric power consortium on the West Coast had ordered up some Chinese transformers. And when they arrived in the US, they found in the hardware and firmware of these systems some backdoors that they feared would enable China to control those remotely. So it's kind of the power equivalent of our worry about 5G communications, where the concern was if you let China build your 5G networks, and particularly your switching systems, you never know whether or not they could be turned on or off remotely in some way. And that panic that led from that, after they took this transformer, sent it off to one of the national laboratories, examined what was going on, and issued the order, which had been brewing for some time, led to this particular set of concerns. I'm not sure that any executive order can organize the United States fast enough on these things. And the October critical infrastructure list is interesting, but it's going to come weeks before a presidential election where I suspect people will be focused on other issues. All of these are helpful. I actually think the Trump administration has done a pretty good job in trying to sort of reorient the authorities here. Some of it building on some work that had been left at the end of the Obama administration, but some of it original entirely to the Trump administration. I wish there was a little more leadership from the top about these dangers, because I think if you're Putin, you pay less attention to signed bureaucratic and executive orders and more attention to what the president is saying.
Pivoting just a bit south from Russia, we have a question with respect to Iran. How would you categorize the American actions against the Iranian database to prevent launching missiles in the Gulf?
Well, that was a pushback against the Iranians that was sort of a second choice. President Trump had considered doing a military strike in response to some Iranian action in the Gulf, and decided in the end that that would lead to significant loss of life and thus possibly escalation. So they turned instead to the freezing of this database, which, if it worked as intended, would have stopped the Iranians from being able to fully understand where their own ships were, where adversary oil tankers that normally would operate under American or Saudi or someone else's control. And it was mostly message sending. The damage done was relatively limited. It was essentially a sophisticated denial of service, right? You couldn't get into your database, but it sends the message, hey, we know where you live and we can get inside your systems. And I think that was what the message was. Was it a temporary significant setback? Yeah, it was. Do I think that it would dissuade the Iranians over the long term? No, I don't.
What do you think would dissuade the Iranians over the long term?
Well, the problem is that almost everything that you would do that would dissuade the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese over the long term, in other words, to make them think the price was very high, runs the high risk of escalation. And, you know, Michael Solmeyer, who's now an advisor to General Nakasone, when he was running the Harvard cyber program, which I'm a member of, used to have this great phrase that says, it's hard to throw rocks when you live in the glassiest house there is. And we live in the glassiest house. We live in the house that is most connected to the internet. We live in the house where people have the highest chance of getting disconnected from something that they really care dearly about. And of course, as you've all heard and know, we don't really control, as a government, much of our internet background here, right? It's in the hands of private actors, and the result of that is that we don't really know how well it's protected until that is tested.
So going back to your earlier comment, you said that you were willing to talk further about Russian activity.
Sure. So, you know, I found the operation to go into the Russian grid to be a fascinating case of deterrent signaling, right? So let's start with phase one. Why are the Russians in our grid? Well, theory one is they're in it because they want to be able to turn it off. Theory number two is they're in it because they want to signal to us that if we ever push Russia too far, they can turn it off, right? And so that was giving them enormous leverage. We were then trying, by putting code that was designed for them to see, which is the most interesting part of this, signaling to them, hey, two can play this game, right? So that's the equivalent, if you simplify it, to the old deterrence theory of, yes, you have missiles that can take out New York and San Francisco, but we can take out Moscow and St. Petersburg. Now, the question is, would either one of us want to go risk that? And once you've put code into somebody's utility grid, is it possible that you might not be in control of something going wrong with that code? Remember, the only reason we discovered the Stuxnet code was it got out of Natanz in Iran and began to spread around the world. And that's what made us all aware of it. There is another possibility that I think is worth considering, which is, what would the effects be of a much more limited Russian attack or other countries' attack on elements of our power grid on election day at a critical time? And actually, for our students at the Kennedy School, this is a case that we just had them try to work through. So let me just give you this, Bryson, as a piece of imagination. Okay, it's election day, you wake up, and of course your mind is going to, is anybody going to mess with the election machines? Well, messing with the election machines is hard, right? Because they're disconnected from the internet. Every state uses a different system. Sometimes within the states, there are different systems. You really have to have people on the ground. It's a really complex thing. The good news for us is that our election infrastructure is so old and so backward that it's actually hard to hack. Probably we should keep it that way. But then supposing you try to do something a little bit different. Suppose instead you said, you know, if we turn off the power in just a few districts in a few key battleground states, it might play right to one candidate's argument, oh, this election's rigged. You're trying to keep people from showing up, you know, especially because we believe that the Trump voters are more likely to show up at the polls and the Biden voters are more likely to go vote by mail, right? So you work into this possibility that if you turn off the power and thus it gets hard to get there, the traffic lights are out, the heat might be off if it's a cold November morning. Most polling systems, if you walk into the actual machines, have to be plugged into something. A lot of polling places in churches and schools and so forth don't have backup generators. So you could cause a lot of trouble in the voting system just by selectively turning off the power. And you wouldn't necessarily have to go do it across the entire state. You could just do it in a couple of key precincts to create the perception hack that you're everywhere. So this is where what you're spending a lot of time on, which is the electric power grid issue, intersects with the voting issue.
No, certainly the interconnectivity, not just technically, but also in a system of systems perspective of lots of different sectors and critical infrastructure, I think is a challenge that we're all still grappling with. And so the final question is really kind of going, if you could provide a little bit more depth on what you've seen about adversaries coming into the grid, because I believe the public reporting has been that we haven't seen anything where they've gotten beyond corporate systems to have the capabilities to impact generation or transmission.
You know, every 2 years, there's this great simulation that the utility companies conduct to go try to game out what a attack would look like. And they were kind enough to let me sit in on part of one when I was working on The Perfect Weapon. My book was published in June of 2018, so I think the one I looked at was happening in the late in the year in 2017. And it was a really interesting simulation because the concept of it was a combined attack of both cyber and physical. The cyber attack was, you know, exactly what you would expect. Code that is put into the system that looked a lot like what the Russians put into the Ukrainian system in 2015 and thereabouts, touching off that panic because you suddenly couldn't control your own substations and so forth. You could look on the computer screen and your cursor was moving around, but it wasn't because your hand was on the mouse, it was because somebody else's. So that was going on inside the building. And outside the building, there were snipers who were shooting through the fence, similar to the fence shooting incident of a number of years ago at one power station. And the result was that the police came and locked down the whole area around the control rooms, so you couldn't get the cyber expertise into the building to go deal with the cyber attack, for fear that they would be caught in the crossfire of whatever physical attack was underway. And I thought that was sort of the most realistic thing I had seen, although obviously it goes far beyond anything, fortunately, that has happened in real life. What worries me is not how deeply code could necessarily be in the utility grid. It's the combined, well thought out event like that throws into such chaos. One observation from listening to that simulation and watching it play out. There were meetings going on of senior levels of utility company executives who are talking to each other on these conference calls that are put together. And to do the simulation, they actually brought in the CEOs and CISOs of some of the biggest of the utility companies who are on it. And they're all talking about what they need to go do technically. And meanwhile, there are meetings going on in the Situation Room and among state officials who are trying to get police or National Guard or something out to the utility companies. And these conversations are taking place in completely different spheres. They're not actually talking to each other. And I walked away with the thought that we still, years after talking about having combined capability here, we still don't have it.
Well, David, thank you very much for a very informative and somewhat provocative discussion here at our lunch keynote at Hack the Capitol. It's good to see you again. It's been a long time.
Good to see you.
And
you've grown a quite impressive COVID beard, I have to say. I am jealous.
This is what 6 months of not shaving will get you, and I still have a few more months left of quarantine to see where I can go.
Great, good work.
So look forward to the documentary on HBO coming out. What was the date again?
October 16th. It's a Friday night, I think around 8 p.m. And of course, it'll be it's HBO. You will be able to download it into your iPad, your phone, and if we can figure it out between now and a month from now, directly into your cerebral cortex.
That's going to be the next line of critical infrastructure
That's it.
when the machines take over.
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Coming up next, we're going to have a fireside chat. As David pointed out, we will be joined by Sean Planke from Department of Energy and Rick Driggers from CISA.